I wanted to mention some of the further obstacles that would stand in the way of indefinite life extension and why it is imperative to overcome these obstacles. Now, in my first installment of this series, I discussed the conflict between the forces of progress and command and control. And this is, in many ways, a conflict between innovative individuals and obsolete institutions that try to freeze the status quo or even move backward. And it would be interesting to conduct a thought experiment about how various established institutions would react to indefinite life extension as a way of identifying the problem. Well, there's one thing that's apparent. It's that if people stopped dying or died at far lower frequencies, only from accidents or very unforeseen catastrophic illnesses which the medicine of the future wouldn't be able to address, then the funeral industry would shrink dramatically and perhaps even go out of business. For the most part, funerals would not be necessary anymore. I think there are many people in the funeral industry who would oppose that development. And in order to keep earning their profits, they would lobby against universal indefinite life extension. They would perhaps try to put obstacles in the way of voluntary human choices to lengthen their lives. What about an entity like the American Association of Retired People? Well, one of the reasons why most people retire, and this is very unfortunate in our current society, is because they perceive themselves as too frail to continue working. And as people become frail, they develop special needs. Health care of the kind that simply delays the onset of disease and death becomes a much more pervasive part of one's life, whereas for a young person it's fairly infrequent and incidental. And then, of course, there are mental changes that occur as people's minds deteriorate and their mental acuity is no longer as high as it used to be. So these special interest groups might find themselves threatened in their current business model. It's conceivable that in a future of indefinite life extension, some people might still decide that they've accumulated enough resources and they can just live off of what they have. They might call it retirement, they might call it something else. But I expect it would look very different from what retirement does today. And furthermore, I suspect that it would probably be temporary, as people who live indefinitely would need to be able to provide for themselves indefinitely. And if they put aside funds for the next 40 years, what happens to them once those 40 years have elapsed? They need to go back to work. So with that in mind, such organizations might either no longer exist because there wouldn't be that much of a divide between people who are in the labor force and people who are out of the labor force because they're taking some kind of temporary reprieve, however long it might be. Those organizations might wither away, or they would need to really reformulate how they treat the pool of people who would be their members. Now, another thing that would definitely change, and I believe this would be wonderful, but it might be construed as threatening for some governments. Programs like Social Security and Medicare would be completely superfluous, unnecessary, because even the stated rationale for these programs is to provide a so-called social safety net for people when they are old and infirm. Well, if people are no longer infirm and they can keep working for as long as they want, and if they want to take a break from it, they can save up the money, and once that savings is depleted, they can go back to work. What's the need for Social Security? And why treat those people's health care any differently than treating the health care of people who are younger chronologically but have the same physical state biologically? Well, I dislike Social Security and Medicare as they are, but in a world of indefinite life, it will be apparent that they are completely superfluous. But unfortunately for the established political class, they are levers of power. They are ways to control the population, to lead people to vote a certain way by bribing them with handouts from the Social Security program, Medicare, the equivalents thereof in other countries, various old age pension systems, and various medical plans that give relatively generous benefits to the elderly. So I can imagine a situation where these politicians whose careers are based on handing out entitlements to the infirm are going to be up in arms against indefinite life extension. Another group that would be definitely harmed in the short term would be providers of so-called long-term care for the elderly. The various nursing home establishments where many old people unfortunately go these days. I wouldn't imagine they get a particularly high quality of life there, but these establishments would not be necessary. If people remained biologically young, then they could live in their own homes, they could take care of their day-to-day needs, and the risks to their health would be just as low as if they were chronologically younger. So these establishments would probably go out of business. Who else would go out of business? Most traditional religions would. This is not to say that religion as such will die out. I would not make that sweeping of a prognosis. But traditional religions, especially monotheistic ones these days, primarily emphasize as their main attraction an afterlife that occurs after death. And it's supposed to be eternal and blissful and just. And so, tragically, as a result, most religious people shun attempts to radically extend life in this world. They might support small incremental advances, beating back a disease here or there, lengthening the lives of select people through medical interventions, at least for most fairly reasonable and moderate religious people. Some fundamentalist fanatics would oppose even that. But imagine that in this world, indefinite longevity were possible and palpable. Then the very uncertain, at best, afterlife posited by the traditional religions would be completely unattractive by comparison. Because if you were faced with a choice to either stay in this admittedly imperfect world indefinitely for as long as you wished, or gamble on an afterlife that you have no way of verifying exists, what would you choose? I would say for most people who have a sensible understanding of risk and reward, they would choose the palpable, accessible, indefinite life in this world. I believe it is the only world, but even for those who have doubts, I think the doubts will be substantial enough to choose this world. So all of the vast, currently lavishly funded religious establishments will crumble, and their purveyors will need to find another line of work. Maybe they could sell you a bridge somewhere. Well, as we can see, even by a very cursory glimpse at this issue, we've already identified a vast constituency that would oppose indefinite life extension. But keep in mind, this opposition is very similar to what the sellers of horses and buggies would have exhibited in the face of the automobile, or what the mainstream media have exhibited in the face of the internet. Every new technology that comes about displaces a particular segment of the current economy. Think about automated manufacturing plants and the various blue-collar unions' opposition to those. It is conceivable that some people in the short term would lose their jobs as a result of a technology emerging. But in the long term, these technologies greatly enhance productivity. They make possible the creation of so much more wealth than could be brought about before. And indeed, they create jobs by creating that wealth, the wealth with which people ultimately get paid. Because real prosperity isn't based on fictitious pieces of paper that come into existence through government fiat. They're based on real tangible goods and services. So the more of those we have, the more means we have to sustain a larger population and to reward people for work. And even the people who lose their jobs in the short term will be able to retrain and redirect their skills to other industries. So all those funeral home directors could respecialize into something else. They could become caterers or biologists or veterinarians or any of a wide array of professions depending on the individual. Just as today, all the automotive workers that are being displaced and losing their jobs because of the various restructurings going on in the U.S. auto industry, they should be able to find jobs in other industries, especially if the market were freer and governments did not interfere in businesses' abilities to innovate and to hire people. So, with that being said, logic is on the side of technological progress, always. Even if a technological advance restructures everything about an economy, requires everyone to retrain, it is still unambiguously beneficial. Think about the computer and the internet. These advances have changed the business environment pretty much everywhere. There are a few pockets of resistance, and unfortunately, some of the Luddites who still resent computer technology still have a lot of power. But largely, computers are here to stay, and they've been accepted by the majority of the population in the Western world, and outside the Western world, the majority of the population wants them and really believes that great benefits will come from them. And I would say that great advances, great technologies, have the benefit of speaking for themselves. The key is have them available and have them capable of making visible differences in ordinary people's lives. Keep in mind, most people are not highly philosophical, not yet at least. Once again, as I mentioned in my first presentation, most people would lack the kind of intelligence and sophistication needed to accurately perceive secondary consequences and implications of various decisions. That can change with various technological enhancements. But even people as they are today, if they see something that is concretely beneficial to them, irrespective of what they've been taught philosophically, they'll come to embrace it over time. The key is to make it available, to make it visible, and to make it so compelling that all of their religious and philosophical objections will not withstand it. I think the approach of trying to achieve visible incremental gains in life extension is fundamentally a fruitful one. The approach suggested by Aubrey de Grey and his Strategies for Engineered Negligible Senescence, and also the Methuselah Foundation, is to first bring about life extension in other mammals. Mice are an excellent candidate because mice have relatively short lifespans, and as a result, a dramatic increase in life extension for a mouse would be 2 or 3 human years. If that can be prominently demonstrated, then a lot of people will start to see the possibilities with other mammals, higher order mammals, and eventually humans. The more visible milestones this movement for indefinite life extension has along the way, the more freely funding will flow for further research and development, and the arguments made in its favor are going to become much easier for the general public to identify with. The big trap in all of this, of course, is funding by national governments. I believe, and here I will diverge from other proponents of indefinite life extension, government funding is a trap. It freezes technological growth and research priorities at a particular point in time. And initially there might be a burst of innovation, but just as occurred with NASA after the 1960s, there will be stagnation. And worse yet, special interest groups, exactly of the kind that I described would be arrayed against indefinite life extension, will bring political pressure restricting the use of these funds, as is happening today and has happened over the past 10 years in the battle over stem cell research. And indeed, these special interest groups would have a legitimate argument. They pay taxes too. It's their money too that goes to support these research initiatives. And so they would argue that they have a right to restrict what goes on. And of course, the costs to progress in human life of such restrictions would be enormous. So this funding and other kinds of support for indefinite life extension has to come from entirely private sources, entirely from peaceful, voluntary persuasion. And while in the short term, it might seem like that would be less funds, in the long term, it would be so much more freedom. Indeed, more freedom from intervention by these interest groups who have a stake against indefinite longevity, and also more freedom to innovate and direct the funds as the most innovative proponents of life extension would direct them. So, with that in mind, let's strive for some visible gains that can be easily identified with by the common person, and that would therefore overcome concerted special interest resistance to indefinite life extension.